Invoking the Emergencies Act has been necessary. Law enforcement agencies relied on it to set up secured areas in downtown Ottawa and at border crossings. It has been the responsible thing to do.
Will Prime Minister Justin Trudeau finally be put on the hot seat to answer for his overreaching invocation of the Emergencies Act? I'm Adrienne Batra. With me is Jamil Jivani. Okay, Jamil, the judicial inquiry, the public commission has begun into the federal government's invocation of the Emergencies Act. Our fellow Canadians will remember when all those convoy protests were going across the country. They blockaded bridges. They made Ottawa uncomfortable for a period of time. They'd set up some bouncy castles and hot tubs, all in the name of saying that Canada wasn't free. They wanted the restrictions gone from COVID. They wanted those lifted. Then Justin Trudeau invokes the Emergencies Act, an overreach, a reasonable approach. We'll find out. And what the challenge before Justice Rouleau is a daunting one. But what will happen, Jamil?
Well, I think it's clear that Prime Minister Trudeau is nervous about this process. He does not want to leave it in the hands of Justice Rouleau, in the hands of the expert witnesses to testify. I think he's worried about being a man on an island. I don't know how many people are going to support the decision he made, aside from his own caucus members in the Liberal government. So I think we have seen Prime Minister Trudeau looking nervous already. He's come out and he's commenting on this before the inquiry even gets anywhere close to completion, saying, it was reasonable, it was time limited, it was measured. He really seems to be trying to convince us, maybe even convince himself, that this was a good decision. And I think what we're seeing play out already is that there are tons of people with perspectives that are going to challenge him from different angles. It's not going to be just a partisan thing. And that's the thing that I think Prime Minister Trudeau really wants. He wants us to feel partisan, that the only people who disagree with him are people who don't want to vote for him or who are conservatives. But the truth is, he's going to get a wide range of perspectives from people from different political backgrounds from across the country saying you crossed a line. And what I think he's most afraid of are the personal stories, Adrienne. If people start to hear about the individuals affected by this, it no longer seems like this big, scary trucker convoy. And we get to hear about how the Prime Minister's decisions impacted everyday people who are moms, dads, workers, students. It's going to be, I don't think it's going to be good for him. And I think he's very nervous about it.
So over the course of the next few weeks, there will be government officials, bureaucrats, tons of lawyers, representatives, individuals that will come before the commission and tell those very stories. And Prime Minister Trudeau is included in that, though he is to the tail end of the inquiry. One of the other things that they have to look at is the federal government initially had said that they invoked the Emergencies Act at the request of law enforcement. They then turned around, Jamil, and quickly had to clean that mess up because that wasn't actually indeed the case. What law enforcement had said was there are tools within the act that we could use in order to manage the trucker convoy. But with the act, invoking the act itself was not necessary. The Ontario Provincial Police, the lawyer representing the OPP, Ontario's police agency, said on the very first day that it was unnecessary to invoke the act. So I think it's already sort of starting out on a bad footing, as it were, for the federal government. But I think Canadians in general, we're reasonable people. It was unreasonable for that convoy to go on as long as it did. It was unreasonable for them to basically occupy Ottawa. Their point may have been a valid one, but I think the part where everybody aligns, Jamil, is when bank accounts were starting to be seized. When the bank account of any individual who would have been perceived as or directly involved with either funding, donating, millions of dollars were raised, which means hundreds of thousands of people donated to the trucker convoy. Bank accounts were seized. That, Jamil, I think is where, when we get to that aspect of the inquiry, it does not look good for the federal government.
I think you're absolutely right. I agree with you, Adrienne, that there can be reasonable differences of opinion on the trucker convoy itself. how it was operated, how long it was there in Ottawa. I think there's tons of good debate to have over that. But I agree that where we start to see not a lot of debate, where we start to see people from across the political spectrum agree, is on the freezing of bank accounts. Scotiabank itself came out and apologized because it didn't believe what it was asked to do by the federal government was right. We've seen stories of single moms having their bank accounts freeze because they donated $50 to the trucker convoy before it was even declared an emergency, and they're still being punished over it. These are the kinds of things that are just inexcusable. And I don't see anyone, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's an expert, an activist, whoever is going to appear before the inquiry, I don't see anyone defending those decisions except for the Prime Minister himself.
Yeah.
And the fact that the OPP has already from day one come out and said, we are not down with this. I mean, how do you justify that when the Prime Minister depended on law enforcement to enforce the Emergencies Act to begin with?
And, you know, I'm going to give you the last word on this, but just the other layers of the powers within this act, so much of what had been gone on, like all you need to do is go through the timeline of events, when this started and when it really started wrapping up. Now, I know there were issues at the Canada-US border, but those issues, for the lack of a better term, were already being, quote, cleaned up. The border was open, the traffic was moving. And then Jamil, it was after the fact that the act was still invoked. Took many of the provincial premiers off guard when the Prime Minister spoke to them on February 14th and said, you know, we're thinking about doing this, we're considering, and then announced that it was happening. So the timeline alone doesn't work in the federal government's favor, in the Liberal government's favor, because they can very clearly see that what the law enforcement agency already had on the books, as it were, was working. And the trucks were being moved, and they were being and people were moving away. No, it wasn't perfect. It still took some time, but again, overreach.
And that's going to be, I think, one of the key outcomes of this entire process is, are we going to be able to identify how much of this was just political? How much of this was the Prime Minister trying to make a political statement, thinking that this was the right thing to do for him to continue being Prime Minister, to continue being popular, to delegitimize his critics, and how much of this was actually necessary? That is one of the key questions. And I think that's the question that Prime Minister Trudeau is most afraid of getting answered.
Yeah. I want to shift gears to something that you've recently written about in pages of the Toronto Sun. And I'm just going to put it to you this way. Why on earth is a ice cream company from the United States involving itself in school board elections in Canada?
Well, I mean, I think if you asked Ben and Jerry's why they took a break from making Chunky Monkey and Cherry Garcia to telling us how we should be voting in our school board elections, they would say that it is an emergency because there are so-called far-right candidates running to be school board trustees. But if you look into who these candidates are and what the actual issues are, I think all parents, all voters would probably agree these are issues worth debating. We've seen the outcry coming from things like the teacher in Oakville with the prosthetic breasts starting a debate about what does all of this mean in terms of gender ideology, in terms of dress codes, in terms of professional standards, all these different issues coming up to the surface that people want to talk about and people expect their politicians to have ideas around and solutions for these problems. And perhaps if you agree with those things, even strengthening the ability to do those things in the classroom. So wherever you are on the issue, I think people expect a debate to happen, and that's what democracy is. The same is true for the removal of police officers from schools. Ben and Jerry says that it is a far-right position to believe police officers should be welcomed into schools as community members to build positive relationships with students. That is not a far-right position. I would argue the majority of people think that that's a good idea. So what we're seeing is the window shifting, where you have a powerful multinational corporation trying to convince Canadians that ideas that we actually want to have conversations about should be things we run away from.
I always find it interesting, you know, especially from the left. You know, it's always the unaffected telling the affected how they should feel. right? We know that Ben and Jerry have a long history from the onset of their company, and that they're activists. They're very extreme, far left wing activists, and they fund a lot of these types of programs, organizations that really are there to erode the fabric of our society, that shut themselves off from any other perspective, and have completely forgotten about the fact that during this pandemic, the last couple of years, when school boards and teachers, teachers unions were screaming for the shutdown of schools, forgot who this really affected, and now they think that they're going to come in with white hats and try to save the day and say, oh, these candidates on the so-called right are trying to deign to say that children's school standards should be raised and that they should be taught in reading, writing, and math versus a woke agenda or critical race theory. It's so absurd to me, because I want to continue to have this discussion in the light of what you just mentioned with respect to the Oakville teacher. That video, you can see it here. The teacher wearing the giant prosthetic breasts with enlarged nipples, tight outfits, showing up to school and teaching shop class. Look at it. Look at it there. Very unsafe. Why are we exposing children to that? I mean, that is about protecting children. That is about safety. Where are they on issues like that? Because say what you will about Rebel Media, their own David Menzies showed up at the school board meeting in the exact same outfit, Jamil, as this teacher, this shop teacher. It's very, you have to do a double take to see who's who here. But he was there. It was a stunt for sure, but he was there to present a petition signed by thousands of people to the school board about having this, shutting this down. What? So I'm frustrated by it, because we have tried to get interviews with the teacher. We have tried to get answers out of Halton District School Board. We have tried to get answers from the Trafalgar School. Nothing is forthcoming. It's like this cone of silence. Don't talk about it. You don't. We see it, but you can't talk about it, Jamil.
Yeah, and that's the frustrating thing about this whole story, is that we should have a political culture where when people are concerned about something, whether you're a student, you're a parent, you're just a concerned citizen, that you get answers from your political leaders, whether they're at the school board, whether they're at the school level, their administrators, the provincial government, the federal government. Every level of government should be responsive to the will of people. And if we see something on Instagram, if we see something on YouTube, if we see something in the Toronto Sun and say, that's odd to me, I would like to know why this is happening, we should have a political culture where people who are elected feel responsible to provide answers to their voters. And this is exposing that we do not have that political culture, that if people can avoid what they deem to be controversial subjects or difficult things, and the reality is a lot of the important things in life are difficult to talk about, we should be expecting solutions brought to the table. So I can only imagine, if I were a parent whose child was going to that school and just feeling like, why does no one think I deserve answers to my questions? Why is everyone treating me like I'm a nuisance for asking for any kind of accountability?
Yeah. We see in the United States, Jamil, a lot of parents speaking up and taking over school divisions and school districts and saying, no, enough is enough with this. But speaking of the US, they have covered this story more, particularly Fox News on the Greg Gutfeld show in the evening. They have a regular segment over the course of the last few weeks on this Trafalgar High School. And they ask a very reasonable question of us in the Canadian media. How has no one talked to this teacher? How has no one had an interview with this teacher? Where is this teacher? How is there no video of him, her going into the school, leaving? How is there nothing in this day and age captured? And I don't have a good answer for it other than we have tried. We have tried, and it's just, and it does lend to you sometimes thinking, and I'm shifting a bit here, but are we being punked by this teacher? Is this teacher, supposedly, was, outraged about a few things last year, and when it came to dress codes and things like that, is he shifted so much now that he's like, okay, I'm going to just test the boundaries, let them fire me, and I'm going to go to the Human Rights Commission. I mean, I'm supposing here, Jamil, but in the absence of any legitimate information, and in spite of an Education Ontario review by the Education Commission, we don't have any information.
Yeah, it's a great question. You're absolutely right. We don't know. I mean, it is possible that this is all a stunt from the teacher, him or herself. We don't know. It could also be a person who is genuinely transgender. And in that case, I think people want to extend sympathy and empathy toward that person and not pile on, which is one of the concerns I always have with these kinds of stories is like, if we focus too much on the individual and not the policies and the system that enables it, then we wind up just piling on to a person who, maybe isn't even prepared to have a public life. So it can be very complicated. And I think that's like, Greg Gutfeld's point is a reasonable one. At the same time, I think at the end of the day, as this teacher works out his or her issues, whether they're intentionally trying to provoke a conversation or genuinely wanting to dress this way, I don't know. But as he or she works out those issues, I think it's reasonable to say we deserve a system that at least gives us answers as to how this happened, whether it's going to be allowed to continue, and what are reasonable measures that can be taken, to use some of Prime Minister Trudeau's language about reasonable measures, what reasonable measures can be taken to actually, deal with this so people don't feel like they've got an education system that is completely unaccountable and running out of control.
Heaven forbid we have any reason when it comes to these discussions. Log on to Facebook and Twitter. Let us know what you think, and go to thetorontosun.com and hit that subscribe button for more stories like this and coverage you won't find anywhere else.